Welcome to the University Museums and to the Christian Petersen Art Museum. My name is Lynette Pullman. I'm director of the museums. We're thrilled that you've all come today to begin the celebration of Peterson's Panthers found. If Peterson lived, he'd be 127 years old. And he began working at Iowa State 79 years ago. Most artists, after that length of time, their legacies are forgotten. Living memory, it fades, and it's only the Pablo Picassos and the Rembrandts that we tend to remember as of cultural largeness. A few years back, we decided that we didn't want to lose Peterson's legacy. And at Iowa State, his legacy almost was lost for lack of attention. And it was through the efforts of a great deal of effort by Dr. Lea DeLong that she has not only maintained that legacy, but she has built it and let it grow through her scholarship and through all of the research that she has done. When we began this Peterson Legacy Tour in the 1990s, we thought that we would organize a retrospective exhibition, do a book with a publication, or do a book, of course with a publication, and do a catalog raisonné, and it would be done. We would have honored Peterson's legacy, we would have placed him in context of American art history. That was the beginning. Since there's been another 4 publications that Leah has been the primary author on. She is the University Museum's guest curator on Christian Petersen, so she's been working on him for more than 20 years. Leah received her master's and PhD at the University of Kansas in American art, with an emphasis in Depression-era art as well as contemporary art. She's written on other artists such as Alexander Pogue, but beyond Peterson, and some wonderful articles on Grant Wood, who, if you're an Iowa Stater, you know those wonderful murals that are over in the library. Iowa State and the University Museums are indebted, deeply indebted to Leah for all the work that she has done, and she will do in the future. We're just now beginning. Each one of those previous 4 books, we always said, okay, this is the last one. We know everything there is to know about Christian Petersen. And now we're saying, well, I don't say that anymore. We have a lot more to reveal to him. Peterson did have a wonderful legacy at Iowa State, and it was those 12 major public works of art that has led to the nation's largest campus public art collection. If not for he and his vision, as well as President Hughes and his vision, I don't think that Iowa State would have the aesthetics that we have today. But today, we're going to explore Peterson's Panthers, and Leah has been on the hunt and sleuthing for quite a while now, and she's going to tell us about that. Oh, but before we do that, I want to mention some other names. This whole project with Peterson Panthers, not only the research to find them, the locating them, the purchasing of them, the conservation, and the installation has been done with private dollars. And those donors are John and Mary Papajohn of Des Moines, Susan and Phil Sargent of Ames, Norm and Rita Reese of Colorado, Max and Monica Porter, also of Ames, Mike Polka of Pasadena, California, Elizabeth Anderson of Golden, Colorado, and Carol Grant of Ames, as well as Georgia. Those people have made this whole process very possible and have allowed us to acquire Peterson's first major large-scale public work of art. So we very appreciate all that they have done. Now, would you please welcome Leah up, and she's going to tell us about Peterson's Panthers.
Thank you, Lynette, for that very generous introduction. And thanks to all of you for coming out today. When Christian Petersen, who was born in 1885 and died in 1961, when he moved to the Midwest in November of 1928, he wanted to start a new life. And start a new life he did. He left his profession as a commercial die cutter, his job, his financial security, and his family behind on the East Coast. Within 5 years, he would have a new family, a new job, a new profession. His new profession would be a full-time fine art sculptor, and his new job would be as artist in residence at Iowa State College. Now, as the first permanent artist in residence at an American college, and a position he gained through Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal art programs. He began a fine arts program of campus sculpture that established a distinctive legacy. As Lynette just said, today Iowa State University has the largest public art on campus program in the country. From landscape scale installations to intimate portraits of individuals, Peterson's art has distinguished Iowa State. But before he came here, he had a completely other, different life, which, however, he seemed mostly to want to forget. For many years, hardly anything was known about his career before he came here. Had it not been for his new wife, Charlotte Garvey Peterson, we would have few records, if any, here at Iowa State about his early career. He seemed to truly wish to recreate himself, and in many ways, he did. When the director of the University Museums, of course Lynette Pullman, decided that we would catalog the Christian Petersen Collection and learn as much about him as possible, none of us had any idea what a huge undertaking that would become. His career before he came to Iowa State was obscure, primarily because Peterson himself documented it so poorly. As we worked, however, we realized more and more that Peterson had produced a fairly substantial body of work during this early period, but most of it could no longer be found. We began the hard, long, and ongoing process of reconstructing his early career. Well, he had been born in Denmark, just a little background, in 1885. He arrived in the U.S. around the age of 9, grew up in New Jersey. He attended vocational schools in Newark, New Jersey, where he learned the professional skill of die cutting. Die cutting is the creation of models used in the production of jewelry, medallions, commemorative coins, medals, small-scale things. It is small-scale work of this sort. Now, this is a World War I commemorative medal that he produced. It's very small, maybe something like that. So quite small. It's small-scale work of great precision and even delicacy. Peterson quickly found steady and reasonably well-paid employment, primarily in the Jewelry and Metal Design Center of Attleboro, Massachusetts, probably beginning around 1907. In the next few years, Peterson seemed to range a bit from his base in Attleboro, probably in his quest to gain more artistic education and find more opportunities for his work as a fine artist, not as a commercial craftsman. Not that there's anything wrong with it, it's just not what he wanted. He took classes at the Art Students League in New York in 1910 and at the Rhode Island School of Design in Providence around 1911 to 12. Though we don't have as much information from this period of Peterson's life as we would like, we do know enough to recognize that he was struggling to establish himself as a sculptor and to be taken seriously as a fine artist. Peterson did not want to remain a die cutter. And however successful and skilled he might have been at that, he wanted to be a sculptor. And it appears that he centered his life around that quest, even while he did continue to work commercially with considerable success and supported his wife and 3 children. Now, around 1920, Peterson installed 2 large life-size sculptures of panthers on the Rhode Island estate of a prominent businessman. What we have come to call the Peterson Panthers were placed atop 2 tall pillars at an entrance to Wild Acres, the estate of Charles J. Davao of Providence, Rhode Island. Now, I'm going to leave this old photograph on here for a long time because I want to give you a sense of the quest the University Museums was on to find these sculptures. For well over a decade, almost 20 years, while we actively searched, this old photograph was all we had to go on. You can imagine how we stared at it. We copied it dozens of times and sent it or delivered it to any persons or institutions we thought might recognize them or know something about these sculptures. I mean, I think you could paper a room somewhere in Rhode Island with all the copies and letters and old photographs that we sent people. We learned of these sculptures because Peterson had mentioned them in his personnel file at Iowa State. One of the few things he did mention, and his archives did contain this old photograph of the Panthers. He identified them only as being on the estate of Charles Davao and being done around 1920. For a number of years, this is all we knew. Well, of course, we were left with questions. How did he obtain such a major commission? How did this wealthy businessman know about Peterson? Who chose the subject matter? Most importantly, what happened to them? Where were they? Well, though these questions were unanswered, sculptures did represent a major leap forward for Petersen. Not only are they on a scale that is much larger than anything previous in his career, they deal with the subject in a form that had few, if any, precedents in his work. Nearly everything of his that we know of before these two works was small scale, usually in relief, not in the round, and was a portrait. Most intriguingly, these pieces have a drama. These pieces up here have a drama and ferocity that is seldom found in Petersen's work from any period. In her program of research on Petersen, Lynette enlisted the aid of Professor Emeritus Malcolm Rugby, who learned that wild acres no longer existed and had been incorporated into the naval base at Quonset, Rhode Island, where Quonset huts were invented, during World War II. We could no longer find any trace of it, its buildings or its grounds or the Petersen sculpture. And as you'll see in a moment, it was a big estate. Over the years, we searched in every way and place we could think of, including making several trips to the Providence area. We looked in the Rhode Island Historical Society, the legal records of the county, Brown University, on and on. Early in our search, we were put in contact with an amateur historian, a person named Tim Cranston, who was an employee of the small town of North Kingstown, Rhode Island, which is the area where the estate had been. Tim was on the trail of another sculpture that had been on the grounds of the Davao estate. It was a massive head of a Narragansett Indian, the tribe which had originally lived in the area. He knew about the Petersen Panthers. Well, they didn't know that they were by Petersen. They had no idea where they were. But he, along with scores of others in the area, knew that Iowa State was looking for these sculptures. Finally, in 2010, after years of search, Tim Cranston got a lead that eventually led us to the Petersen Panthers. Frankly, I had begun to worry that they had been melted down during World War II, because we know that that did happen. Hopefully not to anything of Peterson's, but it did happen. Tim had learned that a family had purchased Wild Acres and owned it briefly before it was taken over by the Navy. The family had taken the Indian Head and the Petersen Panthers with them, and Tim had learned the name of the family, where they had moved, and he even had a contact within the contemporary family. With Tim Cranston's clues, we chased those Panthers through several owners and auction houses. Now, auction houses and owners are sometimes reluctant to share information about the disposition of works of art that have passed through their hands, and it took a while to follow the trail and obtain the permissions for additional information. One person I talked to was suspicious about my interest in these sculptures, which he no longer had, but he wouldn't tell me to whom he had sold them or where they currently were. We kept talking, however, and we sent him the publications that we had done on Petersen, and eventually he began to talk to us and give us his information. Apparently, we were helped because during his career as an executive at Gerber Baby Foods, he had made several trips to Iowa State because of the research that was being done here, and apparently the people of Iowa State had been very nice to him, and he was impressed with your work. All right. Now, with these final clues, we're finally going to change the slide. We finally did find them. Well, no, that isn't still the old one, but that gives you the close-up, and that's just digitally enhanced, as you can see. There they are. We found them. They had been donated to Middlebury College in Middlebury, Vermont, because the mascot of Middlebury is a panther. They were on the grounds of the president's home, and no one had any idea who the sculptor was. Petersen did not sign them, and there is no family mark. The Panthers were proudly displayed as part of Middlebury's art collection, though the sculptor was identified as anonymous. Of all the sculptures by Petersen that we have tried to locate, the finding of these works brought us the greatest pleasure and affirmation. Lynette went as quickly as she could to Middlebury to confirm in person. Oh, sorry, hit the wrong, no. There, yeah, that's right. To confirm in person that these were indeed the long-sought Panthers. And to our great joy, they were. After all these years, we found the Panthers. So here's the old photograph. Here's a shot of what they looked like at Middlebury. So we can see even from there that that's them. That's them, all right. As you can see at once, you've probably already noticed, The sculptures had suffered over the years from exposure to the elements. The surfaces were scarred and discolored, etched by acids that had perhaps never been cleaned off. Lynette quickly realized that wherever the Panthers ended up, their condition needed to be attended to. They were in desperate need of conservation. And these are just a few other shots of these where you can see these drips. You can pick them up here, and all these really bad effects on the surfaces of these bronze sculptures. In addition to the surprise of finally finding the Panthers, Lynette learned something else when she actually laid eyes on these sculptures. Because of their elevated installation, in the old photographs, you could not see the entire forms. At Middlebury, they were installed on ground level. And can you see what we finally saw that we had never had any idea was there? Lynette could see at once that there was an even greater tone of drama about these two sculptures. One of the snarling panthers is snarling because it killed a deer, is beneath her paw, and the other panther is snarling in competition for this kill. Here's the leg, here's the ear. You'll see the better picture in just a minute. Both of these panthers are in a fighting position with muzzles tensed and open, teeth-bearing mouths. They are acutely aware of one another and are reacting to one another. In no photograph could we see the deer. And there they are, uninstalled so that you can get a better idea of what the entire sculpture looks like. They are acutely aware of one another and are reacting to each other. In no photograph could we see the deer, and thus we had no idea of the dramatic situation that Peterson had designed it. Just look at that old photograph. They look just kind of static and heraldic. Not at all. They were very dramatic. The deer's body is somewhat flattened as part of its bulk is obscured, as if part of its bulk is obscured by uneven ground or surrounding foliage. The head is designed to hang slightly down, and you can see that curving down there just slightly, and one of the legs is designed to angled slightly up and would have been affixed to a support. The side from which these old photographs had been taken was not the side where the body of the deer could have been seen. As we look at these sculptures now, knowing Peterson's full composition, it is clear that he developed not just singular sculptures of animals, or even of just snarling, combative animals. He developed a wilderness drama that takes place without the inclusion of humans, but which we can observe and be thrilled by through the sculptures. This is not a passive sculpture, but one that animates the space around it. Ideally, they would have never been placed up so high, where the intensity of the confrontation is lessened. Now, the idea of creating this kind of a trompe-l'oeil visual event or a tableau that involves the space of the observer is something that would later become one of the characteristics of Peterson's sculptural designs. Marriage ring, for example. You can sit there on the edge of the pool among the children, the library, boy and girl. You can walk between them just as you might in real life. In conversations, you can sit or lean just as these sculpted students are doing. So the sculptural space and experience is extended out into our own physical space. Very different from just having a static kind of sculpture. The Panthers seem to us to have been the first in which Peterson used this device. As nearly as we can tell, they were the first sculptures by Peterson which were large enough to create the kind of dramatic extension of sculptural experience that he later invested in his works at Iowa State. Now another question puzzled us. Why had these sculptures been installed in such a way that the intense drama of the Panthers was compromised? When the two are seen at a more of a ground level, the electricity and antagonism between these two creatures animates the space around and between them. Their composition and the relationship suggest that they were designed to be seen on the ground, or at least at eye level. All right, back to the present here. Once we located the Petersen Panthers, Lynette went to work to find a way to get them here at Iowa State with the rest of the Christian Petersen Collection and added to our public art on campus collection. Our donors always come through for us, and this time they did it again magnificently. Within a year of their rediscovery, They had been acquired by Iowa State, were uninstalled in Middlebury, and this is what you see going on here. These are the Panthers being taken out of Middlebury onto the truck, and now they're going to be taken to our conservator, Francis Miller, who will be here soon, and we'll talk to you in greater detail about their conservation. And here they are out at his studio in Hampton, Connecticut, and you can see the enormous change that he has brought about in these Panthers. He's bringing them back to something very close to their original state. He is conserving them in such a way that, with the standard practices of the university museums, they will never again look anything but pristine. Now, in addition, when the Panthers are reinstalled on the Iowa State campus, we believe we will be displaying them as Peterson would have preferred, on the ground. And this is the site where you're going to see them. And so this time next month, when you go to that site, there'll be something else there. The sense of immediacy and nearly physical involvement on the part of the spectator would be in keeping with Peterson's other large works. It will be as if we are encountering this animal drama out in nature. And we think that's really what he had in mind. All right, now, we're going to talk a little bit about the estate and its owner, and then we'll talk a little bit about cougars and panthers. Let's look at this estate and its owner. The estate was called Wild Acres, and it was the country home and hunting preserve of Charles Joseph Davao, who was born in 1868 and died in 1937, whose family had been in New England since the 1600s. The primary family fortune was made by his father, who recognized the potential of rubber for use in medical instruments and practices. Young Charles took over the country in 1909 and made it even more profitable. In addition to his business prowess, he was also known as a sportsman, a hunter, and a yachtsman. His yacht, the Paragon, participated in social events all along the Upper East Coast, especially in Newport and New York. He twice circumnavigated the globe. The Paragon was a large enough and substantial enough vessel that after his death in 1937, it was incorporated into the United States Navy for use during World War II. His country home, Wild Acres, and he also had a house, big house in Providence, and a house in Florida, and that's just the ones we know about. Well, his country home, Wild Acres, was prime real estate, right on the coast of Rhode Island, including parts about a mile and a half of Narragansett Bay, and consisting of about 1,000 acres. Now, that's plenty of land anywhere in Rhode Island. That's major. Davao was everything he should be at a certain high level of the American social structure of the Northeast. He belonged to numerous clubs and organizations that reflected his status and his interests, such as the Society of Mayflower Descendants, the New York Yacht Club, the Rocky Mountain Club of New York, and many others, which he shared with other people of great wealth in the area. Now, he died in New York City a few days before he would have reached the age of 69. Put those two old pictures back on. His wife, whom he had married in 1914, was from a Fall River, Massachusetts family, and newspaper accounts relate that she flew up to New York from Florida to be with him in his last moments. Davao died on April 11, 1937, and on June 4th of that same year, the newspaper of Providence, the Providence Journal, announced that back on April 16th, he died on April 11th, back on April 16th, his widow had journeyed to Vermont, where she married one Mr. Merrill Wade, described as an engineer from Miami. Well, wealth doesn't insult you for all kinds of things, and I'm not going to indulge in 80-year-old gossip, but I call that fast work. Charles Davao's will left to Mrs. Davao the use of Wild Acres for the rest of her life, along with an estate of $2.5 million, and that did not include the yacht. Apparently, the widow had little interest in Wild Acres, but 2 years later, in 1939, the Providence Journal ran a story that, although Wild Acres was nearly abandoned, it was still being kept in tip-top shape. It said 2 men, a horse, and some wildlife are the only inhabitants of the 1,000-acre Wild Acres farm. It was reported, though, in that article that the massive Indian head was still there, as were the bronze lions. Well, lions, but close enough. This was confirmation that these Peterson Panthers had been, to the very end, part of this estate. It is at this point that the fate of Wild Acres becomes muddied and difficult to follow. At some point between 1939 and the early days of World War II, when it was acquired by the Navy, a family did purchase Wild Acres, and from there, aspects of the property were dispersed. When the family left Wild Acres, they took Peterson's Panthers and the Narragansett Indian Head with them and installed them in their house, at their house at Pawtuxet, Rhode Island. When Tim Cranston learned the name of this family, that piece of information started the trail that led to Panthers' discovery. But why had Davao, we wonder, installed a set of bronze cougars, and they're called cougars or mountain lions or panthers, it's all, as I've learned, the same species. Why did he put those at his estate to begin with, especially in such a prominent place? What can we learn about Peterson's sculptures by investigating Davao and his estate and other sculpture of the period? Now, Davao's primary interest beyond business was sport, and particularly hunting. Wild Acres was established in about 1910, mainly, it seems, as a hunting preserve for Davao and his friends. In his obituary in the New York Times, he was described as, quote, a well-known sportsman and nature lover, both afield and afloat. His yacht Paragon still is a familiar craft to yachtsmen in the East, and his kennel and shooting camp at Wild Acres in North Kingston are among the finest in New England. According to an article about the estate in 1921, they said the estate takes in a long stretch of the natural feeding grounds for all kinds of game. Once it was part of the chief hunting district of the Narragansetts. Now, Davao saw to it that his private hunting grounds were well stocked with deer and birds, and he even employed a game warden to oversee all the game. His estate was noted for its Jersey cows and its kennels, supposedly for the dogs that would have accompanied the hunters. Every amenity was provided for Mr. Davao and the other hunters he invited to stock his estate. It may have been his avid interest in hunting that led him to buy or commission from Peterson this scene of the Panthers. The deer, which we now know is part of the sculpture, is the primary prey of panthers and could probably be found on the estate grounds. You might think that hunting prospects in the Northeast, such as Rhode Island, would be quite small, and certainly the game and wildlife was reduced. But it was still possible to hunt in many areas. And it is also still possible that there were some panthers left in the wilds of the Northeast. They do exist. These American felines, known as cougars or mountain lions, jaguars or pumas, range through most of North America and down to South America. Settlements pushed them out of their natural habitats, and also because of their occasional raids on livestock, they were hunted relentlessly, and their numbers declined significantly. But they were still occasionally sighted, even in the Northeast. By the late decades of the 19th century, and certainly the early 20th century, there was a growing awareness of the decline in the numbers of wildlife throughout most of the country. Sportsmen and hunters in particular became concerned about the loss of habitat and the overhunting of game and other species as well. The result was that it was these hunters who were among the early champions of wildlife conservation. If measures were not taken, there would be nothing left to hunt. Now, the primary activists were not farmers or people who needed to hunt in order to eat, but instead were men of wealth and sufficient leisure to hunt for the sport of it. Men such as the most famous hunter and outdoorsman around the turn of the century, Theodore Roosevelt, as you see here. Now, before he became president after the assassination of McKinley in 1901, Roosevelt had been police commissioner for the city of New York, assistant secretary of the Navy, governor of New York, and vice president and many other high offices. He had also been the most famous soldier, I think, to emerge from the Spanish-American War of 1898-99. Roosevelt's Rough Riders had been made up in part of rugged Westerners who personified the lingering lore of the great American West and our former wilderness. One of his Rough Riders, a soldier from Arizona, brought a gift to Colonel Roosevelt, which then became one of the mascots of the company. It was a cougar. It was a little baby cougar cub. After the war, Roosevelt brought the cougar, who had been named Josephine, home and planned to keep it at his home on Long Island. His wife thought otherwise, perhaps in concern for her 6 children. We often associate Roosevelt with the teddy bear, an association which he himself, of course, did not foster. But cougars were also part of his legend, though usually because of his famous hunting expeditions. Newspapers during his administration and afterwards were often full of stories and pictures about his grand hunts. In addition, then, to his political and military careers, Roosevelt was a popular and widely read author. He wrote over 30 books about his experiences as a hunter out in the wild places of America, like his ranch in North Dakota. His tales of life on that ranch, hunting buffalo and other ferocious game, were well known. It was Roosevelt's family who had initiated several early efforts to save animals, to treat them humanely, and to preserve them from wanton destruction. Theodore Roosevelt outdid them all in the number and range of animals he protected, and in the amount of land he set aside forever as national parks and preserves. 5 national parks, 150 national forests were just a few of the statistics about the land that he saved. During his time in office, 230 million acres came under federal protection, actually a little more than that. At the time then, the Davao was establishing his estate and enjoying life as a wealthy sportsman. Theodore Roosevelt, and it's likely that they knew each other, not well, but they were in the same clubs. At that same time, Roosevelt was leading the charge to protect American land and wildlife. As I said, many national parks, forest preserves, bird sanctuaries, and animal refuges were created during his administration. Part of Roosevelt's motivation, of course, was to maintain unsullied areas where responsible hunters could still enjoy their sport. He made it illegal to kill certain endangered species, but he also went on well-publicized hunts, as I said, in which he sought bears and buffalo and cougar and similar wildlife, which he then, after eating what was edible, often sent to a taxidermist, which was a skill he himself also possessed. And the specimens were then displayed in his home or in museums. Now, so a lot of the specimens that were in the Natural History Museum in New York and the Smithsonian were animals that had been hunted and killed, and some of them stuffed by Theodore Roosevelt. One of the early organizations that fostered the idea of protecting and preserving wildlife was formed by Roosevelt and other men of his class in New York. It was the Boone and Crockett Club. Yes, that David Boone, that Davy Crockett. The club championed the sport of hunting, and it also kept records on notable hunts and the number and size of animals killed. It exists today, and avid hunters are still interested in having their hunting achievements recorded in the Boone and Crockett annals. Now, Davao was not recorded as having been a member of the Boone and Crockett Club, but his sentiments were similar. He was a member of several other hunt clubs, and we may suppose that one of his primary motivations for acquiring his estate and stocking it was to ensure a place to hunt for himself and his guests. The very name he gave to his estate, Wild Acres, emphasizes his interest in maintaining a refuge away from civilization, even in the middle of Rhode Island. Commissioning a giant sculpture of a Narragansett Indian is another indication of his awareness of the loss of wildness in America. And also, in his early career, Peterson had produced a portrait of Roosevelt, who died in 1919. We don't know the circumstances of this portrait, but it may certainly reflect the regard in which Peterson held the 26th president. We still don't know enough, we have enough information to make the kinds of links we want to, but we're certainly getting a lot of suggestions and clues. Davao and Roosevelt shared this interest in the hunt then, and it is possible that the character of Davao's estate was influenced by Roosevelt's passion for celebrating, sparing, and protecting nature. Whether Davao specifically commissioned Peterson for these particular sculptures, or whether he devised the subject or what, we do know that Davao chose to have cougars or panthers at the very entrance to his hunting park and estate. For the purposes of celebrating hunting and championing wildlife conservation, he could have chosen several other sorts of animals, like an eagle, like a bear, like a buffalo. All of these are American symbols used in various ways. But he chose a panther, a cougar. It's an animal known for its stealth and its prowess as a hunter and its utter wildness. It is also known for its avoidance of humans and its normal behavior of keeping to the hidden wild places as long as possible. By the late 19th century, cougars or panthers began to be more frequently represented in American visual culture, especially in sculpture. And we'll look at just a few examples. They seem to function in part as a reminder of the drama and the dangers of the wilderness that few Americans encountered, especially in the East. But that didn't mean that Americans didn't still cling to the romantic notions about contending with wild, untamed nature. One of the very earliest sculptures installed in Central Park in New York City was a crouching, hunting panther. And that's what you see here. It's just as you see just above a jogging path, where apparently it still gives people a little startle from time to time. The bronze animal by an artist named Edward Kemis was installed on a boulder above one of the paths in the park, and is one of several other sculptures by this artist which have as their subject panthers and their prey. Kemis also sculpted the lions that are on the front of the Art Institute of Chicago. The panther then was popular already for parks and estates around the turn of the century, and Peterson certainly would have seen this specific sculpture. We know he did. Another artist at the time, a little earlier than Peterson actually, was Alexander Proctor. The American artist Alexander Proctor was an even better known creator of animal sculptures. His stalking panther, down at the bottom here, is a good example of his approach. Proctor was employed by the Bronx Zoo to sculpt the felines that ornamented the lion house of the zoo, and his other depictions of panthers were used for parks and estates, such as the entrance to Prospect Park in Brooklyn, as you see there. Sculptures such as these were ones that Peterson could have easily seen during his visits to New York, especially when he was at the Art Student League around 1910. So these could have been found not only in public places, but also at the entrances to other estates. Around the turn of the century, a number of American sculptors took up the European tradition of sculpting animals and made it distinctively their own. These sculptors were called by the French term animaliers. Animals have been a sculptural subject for as long as humans have been making sculpture, but they usually symbolize human power or strength or function in some way that has mainly to do with human behavior. It is only in the 19th century that the Romantic movement began to investigate the subject of animals for themselves. They were usually images of animals away from human beings, not always of course, but usually just animals doing their own activities. Often the treatment of these sculptures emphasized the violence of animal life in the wild, and there are many scenes of animals seeking or being a prey. In America, there of course were abundant examples of animal life in the wild, and many sculptors focused on those subjects. Among the main differences between European animalier artists and Americans is that Europeans often depicted domestic or smaller animals, such as geese or cats, and a lot of horses too. Americans, on the other hand, although we have plenty of horses and cowboys and all of that, tended to be more interested in wild animals and in depicting those animals in the wild, carrying out the activities that are part of their nature, such as hunting. When the sculptor wanted to do a scene totally from the wild, with no evidence of humans, but only the drama of nature being nature, a cougar was often the subject. One of the best known of these American animalier sculptors, in addition to Kemis and Proctor, was Anna Hyatt Huntington. She was particularly well known for her depictions of panthers. She was active in New York art circles, was widely exhibited in the area, and she used the Gorham Bronze Foundry in Providence. It's a bronze casting company with which we believe Peterson probably also had a relationship. If Peterson did not encounter her personally, he would have certainly been very familiar with her work. I mean, that is what you see in both of these. These are two different separate sculptures of hunting panthers, jaguars, as she calls them here. Now, he may have also shared one of her interests in a sort of model that she took for her depictions. A certain jaguar in the New York Zoological Park, also known as the Bronx Zoo, a certain jaguar known as Senor Lopez was one of the stars of the Bronx Zoo. Known for his ferocious temperament, Senor Lopez was followed in the New York newspapers, and Huntington seems to have based some of her sculptures on this animal. Peterson would have also been able to read about him and watch him pace his cage at the zoo, and, like her, been inspired by Senor Lopez. As he struggled to establish his career as a sculptor, we know that he paid attention to the art world around him. We know that he admired sculptors such as Daniel Chester French and Augustus St. Gaudens. He may even have had contact with them or their studios. We have learned in the past decade that he had a number of exhibitions, was accepted into competitive shows, and was written about in the regional art press. Hardly any of this information is to be found in the papers that he left to Iowa State, and almost all of it has been discovered through the University Museum's research. As discussed at the beginning, Peterson left us with few clues about his early career. Beyond the basic quest of rediscovering his Wild Acres Panthers, we have also tried to learn about the ambiance in which Peterson would have produced these sculptures, what artists with whom he may have shared his interest, and the circumstances surrounding Charles J. Davao and his fabulous estate. While many of our questions are still not answered satisfactorily, we do know that Peterson valued his bronze panthers, that they were among the very few works from early in his career that he cited and of which he kept photographs. It suggests that he did not want them forgotten, and he certainly did not wish to be anonymous in their creation. For decades, through all their travels, the creator of these sculptures was anonymous. He didn't sign his work. But that is no longer the case. Though the greatest mystery of the Panthers has been solved, the location, the Panthers themselves, and the location is soon to be here, many questions persist. We continue to search and research, and more trips back to Rhode Island to study old records are necessary. But we're not going to give up. Our experience with Peterson teaches us that though he is very difficult to find information about during these early years of his career, it is there. He was gradually being more recognized in the region, and notices about his work and his exhibitions are to be found. There will be in local publications such as newspapers around Boston and such, which are not digitized and not even indexed, and which can only be searched by sitting for hours in a library scrolling through microfilm. But eventually, we will learn more about the Panthers. Until we do, however, the works of art themselves will have to suffice. At last, they are here at Iowa State University, where they belong, in the Christian Petersen Art Collection, near the Christian Petersen Art Museum, and with the Christian Petersen Legacy. So, now, thank you. Before we have some comments and questions, please allow me a personal comment here. I personally would like to thank the donors and supporters who help us do this work. There's just no way any of this could have been done without the people who come through for us. And I thank you very much for that. So, who would have a question or a comment about any of these? Yes.
What was the reaction of the people who had the Panthers at Middlebury? Were they happy to have them found and glad to give them, well, not give them, but to see them leave, or what? Was there resolution time also there?
I'm going to ask Lynette to answer that, because she was the one who dealt with them.
They were very kind and very gracious, and there was a lot of collegiality that went into this. I think they were happy for us. I don't think the Panthers were terribly important to them. And so when we got quickly into the negotiations, of course we asked them to give them. But I will say that after we had outside of independent appraisals that came in with varying amounts, they settled on the least amount, so they made them as affordable to Iowa State as they could. I think they were very, again, excited for us that we could add this to a legacy. There's not many campus museums that invest in an artist like Iowa State has invested in Peterson. And so I think they believed that they were in the right, coming back to the right place. So they were absolutely wonderful. And I'm sure with the money that they received from Iowa State for the acquisition,